gut health. And we're going to go through very practical suggestions, but at the same time, I'm going to be going into detail about just a review of how the gastrointestinal system works. That's going to be one thing that I do. Then we're going to go into details about the new generation of tests that are available. And essentially, we'll end the night with more practical suggestions. So more practical suggestions, as well as a review of one of my patients' lab tests at the very end. So let me share my screen. And I see we have a bunch of people calling in on their phones. And good audience tonight. Wow, really, let me scroll through here. I see some names that I know. Hello, Terry, Trisha, Helen, Linda, Sharon, Grant. Nice to see you again, Grant. And some new, a lot of new people coming in tonight. Great. All right, so let me share my screen and we will get started. Okay, so I call this gut health and testing. And we're going to go through these categories. We're going to go through symptoms that maybe somebody has. We'll do a brief review of the anatomy. Then we'll talk about the bacteria in the gut, pathogens or things that shouldn't be there, markers, which you're going to see just in general. It's going to go over certain things that you can see in lab tests, a practical advice, and then we'll see what a lab test looks like in a patient of mine. These two, I think, anatomy and practical advice are probably the most important things. The reason that I want to include the middle parts here is because even though you might not be getting your own lab test in terms of looking at your gut health, it still gives you a general idea of how science is starting to look at gut health. And you'll see that it's still in the infancy of understanding what makes the perfect gut health. What type of microbiome is optimal? How do we assess the barrier function? How do we assess whether you're absorbing things properly? All of those things. How do we see if there's inflammation happening in your gut? That's going to be part of what's happening in functional markers. This will break down bacteria, and it'll even talk about how certain bacteria are associated with certain types of conditions. So anyway, let's go into the questions. So what kinds of things would somebody like me, being a doctor who talks to people who are sometimes having gut issues, what would I ask them? Well, have they been on a lot of antibiotics? And why is that? Because when you take back antibiotics, of course, it's going to affect the natural bacteria that are in your gut. Gallbladder surgery, why is that important? Because your gallbladder releases something called bile, as many of you know, and that gets into the intestine and helps with digestion. So if you don't have bile being secreted into the intestinal tract, then you're going to have issues. Family history, there are family histories of various conditions in the gut. Stressful events can actually affect the microbiome, can affect the barrier between the gut and the body. Proton pump inhibitors and acid inhibitors, like Zantac, is going to affect your gut in a way because, of course, the acid in your stomach is there for a reason. And if that is low acid, because you needed to be on that because of reflux or whatever the case may be, or you had ulcers or who knows what, that's going to affect the overall health of your gut. Now, some people need to be on these medicines. So what can we do to make sure everything else is working well? Toxin exposure, a foodborne illness. So if we've had outbreaks of E. coli and hamburger meat and things like that. And when you have a foodborne illness and you have bacteria, a new bacteria in your gut, that's going to affect the other bacteria in your gut, the natural bacteria in your gut. It's almost like if you look at an environment and, there's sort of too much of something. Like, for example, one thing that would be like an algae bloom, and there's too much of something there that's affecting everything else. And we would ask things like heartburn or nausea, abdominal pain, bloating, gas, constipation. All of these things are potentially things that are going to affect the gut, as well as pretty much everything else in your body as well. So I wanted to review the anatomy here because I think the anatomy is important, and many of us learn this in high school or in college, and of course, we haven't really thought about it since then. So basically, we have the stomach here, and the stomach basically empties into the small intestine, and the small intestine has the duodenum, the beginning. So basically what happens is the food mixes with the acid, turns into something called chyme, which is sort of like a liquid, and that goes into the duodenum. Now, the duodenum, the first part of the small intestine, is also where the bile gets released. So the bile going down to this picture here here's the gallbladder, and it's basically going into the first part of the small intestine. And keep in mind that here we have below, essentially behind the stomach is the pancreas. Okay, so here's the pancreas, and that also basically releases enzymes into this first part of the small intestine. Now, the pancreas is going to be releasing what I just said, which is enzymes. And there's certain types of enzymes, characteristics of these enzymes. So one of the enzymes is called amylase. It digests carbohydrates. And there's another called proteases, which of course sounds like protein and helps to digest proteins. And then there's another one called lipase, which is basically it helps to digest fats. So basically, in addition to the fat digesting bile sort of helps, you also have lipases, proteases, and amylases that are going to be secreted into the first part of the small intestine. So going back to here, the small intestine here is basically going to be responsible for digesting most of the food. It eventually goes through the duodenum and then into the ileum. Now, in the ileum, which is the last part of the small intestine, that is basically going to be absorbing some of the bile that was released up here. And that we'll talk about that a little bit later, because if there's bacteria where you're not really supposed to have that much bacteria in the small intestine, that can affect essentially it can basically affect what's going on in the ileum, the reabsorption. Also in the ileum is also the absorption of a vitamin B12. So sometimes you have to realize that the B12 has to sort of get all the way through here to the ileum. And then as you get older, sometimes you have trouble absorbing it. That's why B12 is often taken sublingually, because it can be absorbed through the mucous membranes of the mouth right into the bloodstream. And so basically after the ileum, it then goes into the large intestine, and then all the way down to where it leaves. So what's going on here? What's going on in the small intestine? Well, we're getting those enzymes released. So that's one thing to think about. We're getting the bile released as well into there. And you're getting an absorption of the amino acids and the fatty acids, et cetera, mostly in the small intestine. So what is happening in the large intestine? Overall, the large intestine is actually there mostly in terms of its mass function would be to absorb water, believe it or not. So it absorbs water more and more and more and more until you have solid formed stool that then leaves. Now, keep in mind that the stomach obviously has acid in it, and then the bile that's released also isn't put into the small intestine. Now, why is that important? It's important because it means that bacteria is really not going to have a hospitable place to live in the stomach for sure, because of the fact that there's acid in there. That should make sense to you. And then when it gets into the small intestine, the bile, as well mixed with all of the acid coming in here, is also going to make the small intestine not a very hospitable place for bacteria. So when we're born, we are sterile pretty much throughout. Shortly before birth, however, we're colonized either through the vaginal passageway, whether it's through bacteria on the breast of your mother that introduces bacteria that eventually gets down into the small intestine. And then within 3 to 4 weeks, basically you have a full microbiome, sort of mature microbiome. So that's basically what's happening. Now, there are conditions, one of them many people know of that some people talk about a lot, there's called a small intestinal bowel overgrowth, is where you get, bacteria in the small intestine and it's not really supposed to be there. Obviously, when you are leaving the small intestine in the ileum, there is some bacteria. But when you get bacteria all the way up here, that is an abnormal thing and can cause all kinds of symptoms like bloating. And we'll talk a little bit about that as we go on. So I hope that's a good review, and I think it will serve us well as we go through some of these more complicated topics. Again, the gallbladder resides sort of right here under the liver. The pancreas is here, releases into the first part of the small intestine, both the enzymes as well as the bile, which helps to emulsify and help digest the fat. And then essentially is going to go through there. It's going to absorb all of the nutrients, and then it gets into the large intestine where the bacteria are. And of course, we'll be talking about that quite a bit. Okay, hope that review was good and clear. Now, we'll talk about the bacteria in the gut. And essentially, what you really, practically speaking, want to come away from that I've spoken about many times in other classes is that diversity is the most important thing. And one way to think about this is think about it as an ecosystem. So if we go into a rainforest, let's say, we have trees, insects, different types of animals, and the more diversity there is, then the more we look at that as a healthy ecosystem. When we don't have that diversity, it's not as healthy. And one way that we look at that is through something called the Shannon's Index, which basically is just something that deals with diversity. Additionally, this phyla distribution basically means if we think about the rainforest, how many types of plants do we have? How many types of animals do we have? Looking at it from a distribution, if you think that each one of these, say, is a different kind of plant, well, in your gut, we have different types of bacteria that you're going to see. And just like in a rainforest, you're going to have some things that are going to be more predominant than others. Maybe there's a certain type of tree in a certain part of the forest that just takes up more of a space than others. And in this case, there are two bacteria here that you see that you basically have more of. One is called firmicutes, the other is called Bacteroidetes. Nonetheless, essentially, we want to make sure that we ensure that we have the most diverse microbiome as possible. Now, we'll get into how to do that from a practical perspective in just a bit, but the short of it is is you want to eat as many kinds and different kinds of plants as possible. And it's not just the fibers in these plants, but also the polyphenols, those pigments, as an example, that are in there that have a direct impact on the diversity and the health of the bacteria that are in your gut. The Simpsons Index is another indicator, and you'll see that as well, but basically looks at more of a how even the distribution is. These bacteria, believe it or not, are associated with certain diseases. Now, they're not the cause of these diseases. And the analogy I use for my patients is, it's sort of like, when you watch those crime shows and they find something at the scene of the crime that helps you to maybe get to who the murderer was in the shows, but it's just found at the scene of the crime. It's not the cause of the murder. It's just found there during the scene of the crime. So these sorts of associations that we see with certain bacteria, I just want to, basically say that it doesn't mean that they're the cause. It's just something that you see as a result of certain diseases. And all of these have associated profiles of, if you think of the crime shows and they do the profile of, they have a profiler come in and they look at, what might be an associated hobby of whatever crime, may have be committed, then these are sort of things that are found at the scene of the crime associated with it. So there are various kinds of bacteria in certain ratios that are more indicative of people who have problems with their cardiovascular health, metabolic health, neurological, all of these sorts of things. And it gives us a little indicator, not that we're going to be able to reverse those conditions by essentially trying to balance out the profile. That's not necessarily going to happen, but it does give us more of an indication that what's happening in one part of the body is showing some kind of appearance in the gut. And there's no question that the communication is going back and forth, meaning that, of course, there's going to be issues with the gut that are going to be associated with all of these things, and that we should be looking at them. We'll talk about probiotic types of recommendations before. So first part of analyzing someone's gut is to look at the bacteria that they have and look at the scales, as we spoke about, in terms of what the diversity is of the bacteria that they have in their gut. The next thing we test for are pathogens. And we have, in our gut, bacteria, we have viruses, we have fungi, naturally speaking, and all of these can basically have essentially a negative impact if they're in the wrong type of ratio. So bacteria, we have some natural E. coli in our gut, but if we have too much E. coli, then that's basically going to cause a problem. So it's like thinking about an algae bloom. The algae exists in that lake naturally. It's only when fertilizer comes in from runoff that the algae bloom basically starts to go crazy, and the entire surface of the lake becomes green, and essentially you end up with fish dying, and the diversity of this particular lake starts to plummet, which of course is an indicator, as we know, of an unhealthy ecosystem. So bacterial overgrowth, whether that's from a foodborne illness or from eating too many sugars or refined carbohydrates, those are going to cause an overgrowth of certain bacteria, but also for types of bacteria that aren't supposed to be there. And the same kind of ecosystem analogy works here. I'm in Miami, and we have all of these iguanas that are eating up these smaller native animals. We also have in the Everglades, we have these king cobras that are not supposed to be here, and they're attacking the alligators and various other natural species. And when they get into the environment, so we have multiple, say, invasive species here in Miami, and this is a problem. It's reducing the natural diversity of the ecosystem here. And that's sort of another analogy. So if we're eating a food that has a variant of E. coli that's not supposed to be in your gut, that's going to cause problems. Also, there's many of you may have heard of an overgrowth of something called Clostridium, and that can be precipitated, brought on by certain bacteria, antibacterial, an antibiotic. And the reason that is because, think about it, it's suppressing certain parts of the ecosystem and allowing essentially one to overgrow. And that can cause a real severe problem. So we have parasites, we have viruses, we have fungi. We're not supposed to have worms, but we can also measure whether or not there are genes in the gut that are associated with antibacterial resistance. So so far, and just doing a time check, so far we've reviewed the anatomy. So we now understand what's going on in the stomach, the small intestine, and the large intestine. We understand that diversity is key and how we need to try to focus on that. We'll talk about that under practical advice that's going to be coming up. And we spoke about pathogens. So we're getting one layer after another deeper to understanding all the different facets that make your gut healthy. So let's talk a little bit about the markers. And maybe this is a little bit too complicated, but I always think that, I always say it's that I want everyone to become their own authority in health. And I always feel like my goal for each class is to cover things at a reasonable depth, some of which maybe you may follow, some of which you may not, but ultimately to have practical advice so that you can really make changes that are going to impact all of these things, even if maybe you don't understand them in the deepest detail. Now, we've spoken about inflammation quite a bit. One of the inflammatory markers is something called calprotectin. Anyway, it's just something that you can measure to look at overall inflammation. You'll see that in the test that we'll review at the very end. And then there's markers of digestive function. Now, remember, we had the pancreas. It sits behind the stomach, and then we saw that it's sort of joined together with the gallbladder, the duct, to go into the small intestine to release these enzymes, and also the bile acid. So when we think about digestive function, we can think about it very, very simply. Is the bile basically, is the bile getting there? Is it doing what it's supposed to do? Are the pancreatic enzymes getting in there? We spoke about those. Remember, we spoke about how they're enzymes for carbohydrates, they're enzymes that break down fats, and they're enzymes that break down proteins. And they're all released from the pancreas. One of the things that we measure is pancreatic elastase. It's like an enzyme, but it's an indicator of whether the pancreas is working okay. Now, the bile acids, which we spoke about, are concentrated in the fasting state, which basically really, it's something I put in here because it's an indicator of the fact that our bodies go through these cycles. Last week, we spoke at depth about all of these cycles that our bodies go into, and that every organ in your body has a cycle. And we're learning more about this as the science goes on. And it's interesting that we did a thing on these cycles and the circadian rhythms. And in the New England Journal last week, my father sent me an article of an amazing review. I wish I had it before the talk, of the latest in circadian science, circadian rhythm science. But essentially, all of your organs go through these cycles. We have our own sleep, and we are awake, and even in the gallbladder, when you're in a fasted state, which is natural, we're supposed to go through a fasting state each day. That's when your bile acids start to be concentrated. And if they're not concentrated, then you're going to have problems digesting your fats. You're emulsifying and digesting your fats. So that means that we want to make sure that we have a good amount of time that we're actually not eating. Now, the other thing that we look at is, are there bacteria that are helping bile acids become other types of, but toxic bile acids? And that can happen as well, where you have these bacteria that are basically not supposed to be there, and they're changing the bacteria changing the bile acids to become actually toxic. And that has been associated with colon cancer and gallstones. But we also potentially have issues with the bile acid malabsorption. We spoke about that. Remember how it goes through the small intestine and then it gets absorbed into the ileum. So all of these things can happen that are going to affect your overall digestive function. What about metabolites? We're going to essentially, we look at two of them. One's called short chain fatty acids. And really, this has become very popular these days to talk about. Some people think that it's one of the most important factors of gut health. And essentially, these short chain fatty acids are things that are released by beneficial bacteria that serve as food for the gut lining. We spoke about how the gut lining is very important because we have to really think about our gut as being a dividing line between us and the environment, because we're ingesting all this food from the outside, and we really only have one cell layer protecting us from that. Now, we are taking in and eating all kinds of things that have all kinds of stuff in there that we probably don't want. Additionally, there are things just in food itself that can be irritating if the lining of the gut barrier is not going to be functioning properly. You think about it in your skin. When your skin barrier is not working well, then your skin is going to dry out. It's going to crack. It's going to open you up to infections in the skin. Well, a similar process happens in the gut. This lining of the gut is really needs to be protected. And if you're low in short chain fatty acids, then the things that are getting into your body potentially can get across into your body. And that could mean things like increased allergies, as an example, because your body is being exposed to all the different chemicals more so than it should. And as your body, sees all of these new chemicals and all these new compounds, at some point your body can say, hey, this really isn't supposed to be here, and it can attack it. And that's essentially what's happening with an allergy. So these short chain fatty acids are really important to be able to provide that barrier between us and the outside environment as it pertains to, your gut. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. Then there's something called beta glucuronidase. Now, glucuronidation, we've spoken about many, many weeks ago, but ultimately forget about these names. The thing to keep in mind is that in your liver, one of the ways that your liver gets rid of toxins is that it attaches something to the toxin so that your body can pull it out of the system. That's sort of partly how your liver works. It goes through these multiple steps and changes and or adds, things on there. Sort of like if you had, some kind of maybe a ball, and it was slippery, let's say, and someone attached like a stick on there to be able to grab onto the ball a little bit easier. That's what's happening in your liver. Now, you don't want to get rid of this glucuronidation, meaning you don't want to get rid of that stick that's allowing me to pull the ball out of out of the bushes or something that you couldn't reach. What happens if you have the stick there and you're able to pull it out of you're able to pull it out of the bushes, but then stick falls off? Then you can't reach for that ball anymore. You can't grab it. And therefore, what's happening when you have beta glucuronidase is that the stick that was there to help you grab that toxin and pull it out has been removed. And therefore, it allows the toxin to basically recirculate into your body. So we look at that as sort of a marker of some problems with the gut. Okay, so we've spoken now in review. We've spoken about the anatomy, which we now all understand really well, some of us for the first time. We've spoken about all that diversity of the bacteria and the analogy of the overgrowth of the pathogens and such. And we've spoken about some of these markers as well as sort of these metabolites and how we measure these things. So now for the last part of tonight's class, we'll talk about the practical advice the lifestyle factors that are going to be important for you to understand based on everything that we've spoken about tonight. And then if we have time, we'll go into one of my patients' lab tests. All right, so for the lifestyle factors, we'll talk a little bit about pre and probiotic foods. Prebiotic is where you're basically giving your bacteria food. That's what a prebiotic is. Your bacteria are living organisms, so they need something to feast on. And that's where the prebiotic fiber comes in. So many of you know me from Miracle Noodle. That's a very potent, one of the most potent prebiotic fibers. So it provides natural food for the gut bacteria. And then we've all heard of probiotic foods. These are things like sauerkraut, things that have bacteria in them, fermented foods. So let's talk a little bit about the prebiotic fibers. Okay, so of course, all plants are basically going to have fibers in them. Some are not prebiotic. We've spoken about different types of fiber in another class. I don't want to go through that in detail, but there's insoluble fiber that your body essentially, your bacteria are not really acting on, that just sort of is going through you. But the prebiotic fibers are really important. And these are some that are very, very potent and have a lot of data behind them to improve the gut microbiome of your body. And ultimately, you want to get as many different kinds of prebiotic fibers, just like you wouldn't feed you go into the forest and, there's animals, there's plants, there's insects, you wouldn't put this one kind of food in there for all of those types of organisms. You want to have a diversity, and this is going to breed the diversity of your microbiome. So artichoke, asparagus is a very good source of fiber, prebiotic fibers. This family, onion, garlics, and leeks, very, very potent prebiotic fibers. Bananas, sort of on the unripe side, are going to have an incredible prebiotic fiber. Chickpeas, the pectin in apples is fabulous. Jicama, very, very high. Yacon root, sometimes you see that has something called inulin in it, which actually has a natural sweetness. Sometimes you see foods that have yacon syrup in them, and those are very high in inulin. You can buy powdered inulin that some people put in, mix into coffee. The key, as I said, always is diversity. I'll be talking a lot about sort of diversity of leafy greens next week, but ultimately you want to get as much diversity as you possibly can. You don't want to have jicama every day as your only type of fiber. You want to have a mixture of things: flax, almonds, lentils and chickpeas. In terms of the studies, have really great benefits, not just in terms of the prebiotic fibers, but associations with weight loss and lower cholesterol, whole host of things. There's also the concept of postbiotics. So if we know what a prebiotic is, of course, it's feeding the bacteria, and a probiotic, which I didn't quite mention, but we're talking about things like, we'll talk a little bit about in digestion, things like sauerkraut and kimchi. Those are going to have bacteria in them, but there's something called a postbiotic, and that's what happens. That's what your bacteria release after they've eaten. Believe it or not, a lot of the incredible things that we're finding in microbiome science is that there are certain things that happen after. In other words, as an example, there is a compound that is released based on, not on fiber, but on the polyphenols of something of pomegranates. Now, what happens is, of course, if you drink a little bit of pomegranate juice, there's no fiber in there. So how is it going to improve your gut? That's really the question. The question and the answer to that question is that these polyphenols that are going to cause a release of something called a postbiotic. And a lot of these postbiotics, like for example, the one with pomegranate juice, we believe is going to be a very potent protector of things like heart disease, believe it or not. So there's lots of things that happen when your body sees these pigments. And basically this chart from I got this from the company that I ordered the blood test from. I'm sorry, the stool tests for my patients. But as you can see here, curcumin is going to change the ratio of various bacteria in the gut. Resveratrol, which all of us have heard of probably, is partly the pigment that you see in grape juice. Reduces all these, we spoke about that beta glucuronidase. We don't want that stick to be removed from the ball, and calprotectin, which is that anti-inflammatory thing. Measure of inflammation goes down. All of these things happen as a result of the pigments and some of the chemicals that are not fiber that are in your food. And to me, I think that's amazing. It says here, polyphenols are widely found in plant foods, vegetables, fruits, grains, legumes, nuts, seeds, herbs, spices, wine, tea, coffee, and cocoa. To me, it's amazing because with more diversity of all these incredible plant chemicals, which I've stated many times that, we know of so few. There's like literally tens of thousands of chemicals that are in plants that we have yet to even discover what they do. This makes science so, something that is so incredibly exciting and fascinating, because as we learn each one of these things, we see what happens. These are just, as an example, quercetin and green tea, curcumin, resveratrol, polyphenols in general. I mean, this chart could, in 50 years with artificial intelligence helping to sort these things out, is going to be gigantic. And there's going to be more and more and more and more evidence that the diversity of plants that you're going to be eating is going to be providing benefits that we have not even, we can't even explain right now. It's really an incredible thing. Okay, so let's go back here to digestion as we get closer to the end of tonight with some more practical suggestions. So obviously, eating too fast is going to be a problem. We want to slowly chew our food. We want to ideally be with people while we're eating so that we can create an aura of, now we are eating, giving signals to your body that this is the time to eat. This is the time to relax. It's not the time to be working while you're eating. It's a separate type of thing. Thinking about cycles, we're now in the phase where our bodies are going to be ready to relax and to absorb food. If your body is in a fight or flight response, it's not going to want to digest the food. And that makes sense. If you're being chased by a lion, your body is not going to invest any energy into digesting food. It just makes sense. And that's basically what happens. Chewing, I spoke about amylase being released from the pancreas to help with the digestion of carbs. Well, believe it or not, amylase is also in the saliva. So the digestion of carbohydrates, as an example, actually starts in the mouth. A couple of weeks ago, we spoke actually about nitric oxide and how certain which opens the blood vessels, and that's very healthy, has to be activated by a certain bacteria in your mouth. And if it's not there, you're not going to get the same amount of blood vessel dilation that you normally would get. Enzyme supplementation can help. We spoke about the pancreas and those enzymes, and some people have issues with that. And you can supplement with their supplements that have these enzymes. For example, people who have gallbladder issues sometimes will take bile acids as well as digestive enzymes. But there are also foods that naturally have enzymes in them. So this is to me is very interesting. So we spoke about these. You already know these. So we already know that amylase digests carbohydrates. We know now that protease digests protein and lipase digests fats. You've learned that tonight. Now, the digestion of carbs, believe it or not, there is actually a little bit of amylase in honey, mango, bananas, kimchi, sauerkraut, and koji. Now, koji is a fungus that lives on rice, and it is the base foundation of a lot of Japanese food like miso and natto and even soy sauce, sake, all of these things um, are made with koji and probably have amylase in them. A lot of people think small amounts of sake, as an example, can help with digestion. It could be related to the fact that not only do koji-based foods, again, miso, natto, sake, soy sauce, have amylase, but they also have protease and lipase. So really remarkable thing. Of course, kimchi and sauerkraut also, it's a probiotic food, meaning it has bacteria in the gut. I'm sorry, it has beneficial bacteria that can help the gut. But in addition to that, during the fermentation, releases actually enzymes that help with the digestion of other food. So that means that if you eat some fermented food with your meals, with each of your meals, which is what our ancestors did, quite frankly, in many parts of the world, that would help them digest, because believe it or not, it also has protease, these fermented foods, and it also has lipase. So these fermented foods, in addition to the beneficial bacteria, you'll often hear of people who are, eating a peculiar way, who avoid fermented foods for some reason, say that, well, the bacteria is not going to make it past the acid and enough to populate the gut. Well, the truth is that it's not just the bacteria. It's also the fact that there are all these enzymes that are formed, as well as B vitamins. There's an increase in B vitamins when you ferment vegetables as well. So what digests protein? Well, there's some very potent digestive enzymes, proteases, in papaya and pineapple. Many of you might have had the experience of eating a lot of pineapple and sort of getting a little bit of irritation in your mouth, because there's actually digestive enzymes in there that are potentially breaking down some of the mucosa in your, some of what's going on in your mouth. Honey also has some proteases. Kefir, which is, a fermented milk, also has it as well. And kiwi and ginger also can help with the digestion of protein. As far as fats, the same thing goes. I mean, it's amazing what you get out of fermented foods. Really is. Kefir as well helps with lipase, helps with digestion of fat. And avocado, naturally, of course, it's a high-fat product, vegetable, fruit, I guess, technically. And it has lipase in it as well. So I found that really interesting. Intermittent fasting can help with the balance of your gut bacteria. And it makes sense, doesn't it? Because we've spoken about last week, we spoke about these cycles. It makes sense that not only throughout the body, but in the gut, that having a period of no eating, which is sort of how we evolved, is going to have some beneficial effect. And that's been shown. Reducing refined carbohydrates, that's essentially important because, again, you can think about it from that perspective of the algae bloom, where the algae is going crazy because it got the wrong food, the fertilizer runoff into the lake. Well, the same thing happens when you're eating refined flours and refined sugars. It's going to cause an overgrowth and a decreased diversity of your lake inside, of the gut that you have. Healthy fats are important, of course, as well. Okay, so we've covered actually everything that I wanted to talk about tonight, and I think we covered everything in hopefully detail that that you understood. I'll just share because a fair number of you had some really good feedback when I reviewed one of the lab tests for my micronutrient panel. It was a test that basically looked at all the different vitamins. So this is a lab test of a patient of mine. Let me share my screen, and that's sort of how we'll end tonight. I've removed her name, obviously, but in review, she is a 53-year-old. She owns her own business. She works probably 60 hours a week, very hard worker. She has been complaining of constipation and a little bit of weight gain. The constipation is worse when she's traveling, and she occasionally gets bloated and has constipation. So we've spoken about these. I'm going to go through this. I'm only doing this because last time people had asked for other lab tests and these are sort of a new generation of lab tests. So hopefully you can see my screen. Let me make this a little bit bigger for myself, actually. There we go. So we spoke about gut diversity and how important that was. And we spoke about both of these indices, I guess you could say. And you want them to be high. So her gut diversity is not as good as potentially it should be. And this is the phyla that we spoke about. The ratio here is not optimal, but not terrible. And then we spoke about the diversity and how there's an association between certain conditions that exist. For her, everything seems to be pretty decent, except for this, which is called SIBO, which is where we spoke about how there could be gut bacteria in the small intestine, and it shouldn't be there. Now, this test is not going to be able to diagnose that. Remember, we spoke about how these are associations. They are, things found at the scene of the crime, essentially. So if she has bloating and she has other symptoms, such as we spoke about, then we probably should get a specific test for that. Now, if we go through what we went through, this is her short chain fatty acids. Remember, we spoke about short chain fatty acids and how they provide a food for the gut lining. And hers are essentially, here, the valerate are low, essentially. And you can see here, her short chain fatty acids. These are her bile acids. We spoke about the bile acids, and hers are normal, but her short chain fatty acids here are very, very low. We spoke about the pancreatic enzymes. Hers are a little bit low, and her fat and cholesterol in her gut are a little bit high, which basically means that we should potentially look at her pancreatic function, maybe help her with enzymes to help digest the fat, specifically those that have, say, lipase in them. And lactoferrin, I'm not going to go into that now. We spoke about that glucuronidase, that's getting rid of that stick. Hers is normal. And other aspects of her gut lining seem to be okay. But again, here's this short chain fatty acids. Short chain fatty acids are very, very low. And since, and in a ratio that potentially is a problem, but overall, totally very low. This is what we spoke about before. And that's just a review of what one of these lab tests sort of looks like. Now, going back to here, it's actually the report is actually much bigger, and it goes through all the bacteria in the gut that is there and the associations. And as a result, you can look at it as an example, and they give you recommendations for certain beneficial bacteria, probiotics, that one could take to improve that. And so they list all that here, as well as some supplements that are going to help based on the bacteria that the person has in their gut. So just an example of what one of those lab tests shows. So thank you very much for your attention. And next week, we're actually going to be speaking about leafy greens. It doesn't sound exciting, but I guarantee you it will be. And the reason is because, of course, we all know that we need to increase our leafy greens, and we know from tonight that we need to increase the diversity of our leafy greens, meaning we should be getting them from different plant leafy green families. And I'm going to go through ways of preparing them that we haven't thought of. We'll talk about all of those sorts of things, talking about, drying, stir frying, fermenting, steaming, a whole host of things, as well as the different properties, different flavors of leafy greens, how to incorporate them. If you don't like leafy greens, you'll have suggestions on how you can improve your intake of leafy greens. If you like leafy greens, you're going to have new ways of preparing them that's going to add to the enjoyment, because I tell you every week you need to eat leafy greens. And it's great for me to say, eat your leafy greens. But in this case, I'm going to give you very specific ways of increasing them in your diet. And honestly, you'll feel so much better when you really get that good, decent amount. I'll talk about how much of the leafy greens that you should be eating. And of course, it makes sense that your gut needs to be healthy, for you to absorb that. And we went through all that tonight. So hopefully the lifestyle suggestions that we spoke about tonight will optimize your gut to be able to digest the food and incorporate lots of new plants into your diet. So I hope everyone stays warm. Most of the country is frozen. And as always, I appreciate your attention and all of your comments as well. And I look forward to seeing you next week on a Wednesday Night Live, which will be, I think, our 49th or 50th episode. So how amazing is that? Almost a year. Wish everyone health, stay well, eat well,